Okay, so as a start, could you please say and spell your name?
Fred Moten, FredMoten.
Great. And do you mind just giving me an autobiographical thumbnail sketch where you're from,
Okay.
who you are, what you've done, what you're doing now?
Well, I was born August 18th, 1962, in Las Vegas, Nevada. My parents were part of the sort of late westward swing of the Great Migration. My father was from Louisiana, a small town called Lake Providence. My mom was from a small town in Arkansas called Kingsland. I'm an only child. Lived in Las Vegas for the first 13 years of my life. And my mother, after my parents divorced, my mother went to graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh. I lived there for 2 years. And then 2 years, spent my last 2 years in my mom's hometown, living with my grandmother. My mom was there for 1 year, but then she had to go back to Las Vegas to try to find work. And I stayed with my grandmother and finished high school there. And then went to Harvard for my undergraduate education, and then Berkeley for my PhD. And since then, I've just been on the move, on the academic circuit, moving from jobs to job. Worked in California a couple of times, in New York, Iowa, and now where I currently work is in North Carolina at Duke University. So, and for the last 25 years, I've been with my partner and wife, Laura Harris, and we have 2 kids, Lorenzo, who's 7.5, and Julian, who is 4 3/4. So if this is on the record anywhere, I just want to make sure that he knows I've been precise. He's picky about that kind of thing. So.
Well, I know you're a poet. You have a day job as an English professor. I've heard you called a philosopher. How do you self-identify? If someone asks you what you do, what's the answer to that question?
Well, I don't think I would ever call myself a philosopher, just because I have, a healthy respect for that discipline and know the difference between what I do and what professional philosophers do. I'm interested in philosophy, so I try to read the stuff that I'm interested in, but it's a narrow range, probably, and within a very kind of specific set of questions and issues that I'm kind of obsessed with. But I think of myself probably as somebody who, if I had to pick one discipline that I feel embedded in, it would be performance studies. My PhD is in English, but I feel like I kind of started working on a set of issues that were already kind of on the outskirts of what literary studies was concerned with. Not just because I was concerned, primarily with Afro-American or Afro-diasporic literature, but also because I was really interested in music. Mm-hmm. So, and in just sort of a broader range of kind of expressive cultural forms. So I started teaching, or I taught for a year at NYU in the Performance Studies department. And by the time I got through sort of giving myself a kind of quick tutorial in performance studies, I realized that in a way that was kind of where I would feel most comfortable. So even though since then I've always taught in English departments, or maybe jointly in American Studies or something like that, I still think of that being sort of my field.
Let's go back to Las Vegas for a minute and then kind of work our way back to where you are now. First of all, how did your family end up in Las Vegas?
Well, it's a long story. I mean, my father's family I'm a little less up on the exact contours of the story, but I know that my father came from a large family, again from a small town in Louisiana called Lake Providence, which was also close to another small town called Tallulah. And growing up for me as a kid, these were towns, especially Tallulah even more, where I just never remember being in a conversation where somebody wasn't talking about these places in this totally active, sort of invested way from the very beginning. So you felt like when people talked about home, when I was growing up in Vegas, that meant Louisiana or Arkansas, not our houses in Vegas.
And you spent a good bit of time in these places.
I actually went to Louisiana once when I was a baby. Don't remember it. But I did spend a lot of time in Arkansas and went down there in the summers and lots of visits and stuff. The reason we didn't go to Louisiana was because my father's mother moved with her children when they moved to St. Louis, and then when a bunch of them moved to Las Vegas in the late mid-50s and late 50s. So his whole extended family was in Las Vegas for the most part. Since, like I said, since the mid or late 1950s. And I think a lot of working class black people moved to Las Vegas, especially after World War II, partly because of their experiences maybe working in like Nellis Air Force Base, which was a huge Air Force base. And then when the casinos started to be built and the gaming industry became huge, Vegas was a place where so-called unskilled labor could go and get jobs, which were union jobs. I mean, Vegas at one point, it's suffering today, but it's really maybe outside of Detroit in a certain way, one of the last really big, huge union towns in the United States. And there was a culinary union, which included not just people who worked in restaurants, but also maids and casino porters and stuff like that. So all my dad's aunts were maids, or my dad's sisters, were maids in the hotel room, in the hotels. My father worked as a porter in the hotel, and then had a job that was a culinary union job working at the Nevada test site, which was also a huge employer. So that there was, like I said, you could come to Vegas, buy a house, get a relatively good job with sort of union wages. And that was so that there was a kind of economic opportunity in Las Vegas. It drew quite a pretty decent sized black population. And along with that, there was an interesting kind of black cultural life in Vegas at that time, because the hotels in Vegas were so segregated.
Right.
So the entertainers who came to play in those hotels would then have their kind of after hours life on the west side, which is the black community in Las Vegas. So there was one famous street called Jackson Street that had, I don't remember it, but I've heard stories, and it was just these really hot swinging places where, the members of Duke Ellington's band or Count Basie's band not only played there, but then lived in that community when they were in Vegas. So you could go down Jackson Street and hear anybody, and which meant that over the course of time, Vegas became a big jazz town, partly because also LA musicians could come to Vegas and work in the pit bands for the shows and make a good living. But anyway, I don't know how I got off on that, but that was my father's side of the family. My mom went to school in a small town in Arkansas, and then went to college at the University of, what used to be called Arkansas A&M. It's now University of Arkansas Pine Bluff. Studied sociology, and then she went to University of Arkansas in Fayetteville for like a year to do secondary education, but didn't stay up there. Fayetteville was really segregated. It was up in the Ozarks and in northwestern Arkansas. I think she lived in a dormitory, in the basement of an empty dormitory, to maintain the segregation and stuff. But anyway, so she went back, finished her master's at University of Arkansas Little Rock, and then went back to another small town in Arkansas called Monticello and was teaching, and had decided at a certain point that she wanted to get her PhD in sociology. But my grandma really rebelled, and I guess didn't like that. So to make a long story short, she ended up moving, eventually spent a little bit of time in Chicago, couldn't get a job teaching there, a little time in Flint, Michigan, and then eventually ended up in Vegas because she heard about the fact that, heard that because of the rising black population, there would be some opportunities to teach school there. Her degree was in secondary education, but she wasn't allowed to teach in the high schools. But eventually she did get a job teaching in the elementary schools in Vegas. She was doing day work when she first moved to Vegas, and luckily, it's just sort of a happy accident, one of the houses that she cleaned belonged to this guy named J.D. Smith, who happened to be the president of the school board in Vegas. So his wife, in talking to my mother, found out her story, and that's how she got on the substitute teachers list and eventually got a job teaching in Vegas. And this was like 1960, 61, maybe.
So, Las Vegas is a town that changed an awful lot during the 13 years that you were there. What do you remember about that? Or what do you remember noticing about the world that was kind of shifting around you? And especially, maybe not just in Las Vegas itself, but when you were traveling back and forth between there and Arkansas. Because these are crucial years we're talking about.
Well, the travel back and forth between Vegas and Arkansas was not, it probably didn't seem as drastic as, for me, as it might have from outside of that circuit, just because in a lot of ways the neighborhood I grew up in was a kind of small town in Arkansas that had been transplanted to Vegas. It was very much kind of on the order of what Morrison talks about in that essay, City Limits, Village Values, where it was a kind of transplanted village in many ways, or a mixture of transplanted villages. Some of them coming from Arkansas, some from Louisiana, some from Mississippi, some from Texas. But
does anything like that still exist in Las Vegas?
Well, this was during an era when, housing segregation was pretty, solid.
Right.
So if you were black, for the most part, you lived on the west side. And so I think that at that point, it was a common kind of thing. Now, I think it's less common. There's still a kind of core community on the west side that's black, but I would probably say that the majority of black people in Vegas now don't live on the west side, or I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. But so that's one of the things that changed is, at that time in the early 60s, Nevada was known as the Mississippi of the West. It was highly, intensely segregated. A lot of people, when they think about Nevada and Las Vegas, they associate it immediately with, the mob and organized crime. But the real political power in Las Vegas was the Mormon Church. And this was at a time when the Mormons still, as a function of their sort of theological, beliefs, basically didn't really even recognize the humanity of black people. And that put tremendous amounts of pressure on the black population there in terms of just being constrained to live in certain areas and obviously limited in various ways to certain kinds of jobs and stuff like that. So I think the years that I was in Vegas were part of a big transition. And my mom was very much involved in it because she was very active politically.
So were you aware of these things
yeah.
because of that? It was just part of the discussion.
It was at my house. My mom was one of the people who kind of constituted, I say, a sort of a bridge between the small, sort of progressive community, I guess you could say, in Las Vegas, which included some folks who were involved, some friends of hers who were involved in League of Women Voters, and then also some people who were involved in what I now realize was a kind of Catholic-based community that was organized around our church growing up, St. James, or not St. James, Man, that's no. I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of my. Well, I suppose what a heathen I've become. But the Catholic church I attended, in which was the only Catholic church sort of on the edge of the West Side in Vegas, and for a time there were these Franciscan priests and some nuns who lived in the community, and who I think basically were operating in a way that was sort of similar to the kind of liberation theological based communities that had begun to emerge in Latin America in the 60s. I know that they were influenced by that.
Right.
By that.
Was this a mostly black church or not?
It was a mostly black church, and I'll think of the name of it in a minute. I can't believe I can't. But anyway, but it was a mostly black church, but with sort of young lefty kind of hippie priest named Father Louis Vitale and these two sisters, Sister Mary and Sister Carol. And like I said, they lived in the community and did a lot of interesting kinds of political and social work in the community. And my mom was involved with both of these groups of folks, but she was also definitely part of this sort of immigrant black Southern community that had emerged. She taught school and knew a whole lot of families and a whole lot of people from Arkansas and also from the other southern states whose children she now taught. And so she was a kind of person who kind of bridged these different communities. So a whole lot of the kind of interesting political work that began to emerge in the mid-60s and late 60s was stuff that my mom it was like happening in the basement of our house. There was a Black Panther Party chapter in Vegas, and they were my mom's students. They met in our basement, But my mom would have like some white students who lived across town, and who had they would come to our house to listen to music, So our house was like this. Actually, was that's that line from James Brown's song "Get on the Good Foot." Where the long-haired hippies and Afro-blacks all got together across the tracks and they party. That was our house, so that there was always this kind of stuff going on. And what this meant was that there were definitely some changes that occurred in Vegas during that time, and various forms of resistance to segregation, and particularly a lot of activity around school desegregation, which my mom was involved in.
You said you were there till you were 13.
Yeah.
That stuff is still going on at the time that you leave Las Vegas?
The school desegregation? Yeah, I mean, we left in summer of 1976. And school desegregation had finally, it was just a big, huge court case. And eventually it went to the Ninth Circuit Court in San Francisco. I mean, I lived with this stuff. It was always going on in my house. I think I was like 4 or 5 years old, running around talking about I knew the difference between de jure and de facto, because I was always these questions. And so there was finally a desegregation plan that was put forward, and it was sort of imposed upon the Clark County School District, I think in 1971. And it went hand in hand with the fact that after the 1970 census, there was redistricting politically, which meant that in the 1972 election in Vegas was the first election where there were going to be black representatives on the city councils of Las Vegas and North Las Vegas, which is a sort of twin city. And there was always, we had one black state legislator who was a Republican named Woodrow Wilson, believe it or not, who was the lone black elected official, I think, in the entire state up until maybe 1972. But he was actually defeated in that 72 election. So at that point, we had, I think now 2 state assembly people, one state senator, a county commissioner, school board member, stuff like that. So all of that, so that school desegregation and then the political redistricting was all stuff that happened, that people had been fighting for, basically, and then finally came into existence in the very early 70s. So,
And then where did you go from Las Vegas?
to Pittsburgh.
And how long were you there?
2 years. My mom decided that she was going to finally go back and get a PhD, and this time she wanted to do public administration at the University of Pittsburgh. So she got some kind of a Mellon or something fellowship to go back there, and partly I think it was because my parents had divorced, and that was a whole kind of hard, complicated thing, and for a bunch of different reasons, I think she felt like it was a good thing to move, but she wanted to go back to school, and so that's what we did, and I ended up going, which is a pretty big move because Vegas at that time was, I think, I still remember going past the city limits, and I think at that time they had a sign to leaving Las Vegas, and I want to say that the population at that time was like maybe 320,000 or something like that, and I think there's like, I don't know, more than 1 million people, like 1.5 million people in the Vegas area now. So a lot of that really massive exponential growth kind of happened after I left, but it was still a very fast growing city even during that time when I was there, because there was always a boom in Vegas because of the gaming, so you could always get a job in Vegas. I think up until the last 5 years in the current crisis, when things really began to collapse there too. So.
Can you talk a little bit more about, you've said a bit about it, but you're kind of coming to consciousness, you're kind of coming to political consciousness, maybe also you're coming to intellectual consciousness. Like, when is the first time that it occurred to you that you might want to do the things that you have ended up doing as a thinker, as a...
Well, I just remember, again, I mean, anytime in a conversation like this, you hear me talk about my mom, and it's all kind of through her. I remember my mom talking about the sociology professors that she had at Arkansas A&M, and how she was, I can't remember far back enough to not have heard her talking to me about the sociology text that she was reading, that those teachers had assigned to her, like Hortense Powdermaker and John Dollard and all this stuff. So, and she had lots of books, and I guess I was just always kind of a bookish kid, so I was always kind of picking around in her books and looking at stuff, and she had this great anthology. I forget who did the editing of it, but I still have it because I have it wrapped up in my with rubber bands, called Black Voices. So that's where I first read, Baraka and Langston Hughes and stuff like that. Like when Angela Davis was on the run from the police, I think part of the time she spent in Vegas. But I know that after the trial, she came back to UNLV to talk, and I remember, like, one of my prized possessions is a copy of If They Come in the Morning, this anthology of prison writings. And when she spoke afterwards, she was sort of talking to somebody. My mom pushed me over to get her autograph on the copy of the book, So I don't remember not having this stuff be a huge part of my, life. I mean, I remember when King was shot, and I was 5, but it meant something to me. I knew who he was, and because I had been taught that, I remember my mom crying, I remember, so I don't, I can't go back far enough to, and all of the stories that were told in my family were stories that seemed, the ones I remember now at least, are always the ones that had a kind of political edge to them, stories about my grandmother and grandfather having to fight to get a school bus to take my mom to 8 miles away to Fordyce to go to high school, because there wasn't a black high school in Kingsland, Arkansas. and a school board member in Kingsland coming to threaten my grandfather with his pistol on his hip, and stuff like that, So, these things are, just like mine. Kingsland was the birthplace of Johnny Cash, So, whenever we would go to Kingsland, we'd drive past. There was Dave Cash was his uncle who owned this big farm, and my grandmother picked cotton, my mother too, on that farm. I mean, that's how my mom got sent to Arkansas A&M, stuff like that. So these things were just part of the air,
Mm-hmm.
and my mom, I think, just always had like this real intense sort of political consciousness. And like I said, that's just, I don't think our house was that unique. It was also just that moment, everybody, I don't want to romanticize it, but at least with regard to where I grew up and the people that I was around, there wasn't a whole real big, huge kind of dividing line between your everyday life and living in the movement.
Right.
It was, eventually my mom was elected to the school board in that 72 election. And I just remember when issues came up that were of specific, importance to education in the black community, it was just like this phone tree. She'd get on the phone, start calling people, and it'd be 600 people at the school board meeting that night. And people were sort of mobilized. And also at this time, Vegas was like, there was this really intense radical movement amongst, for welfare rights in Las Vegas that people have written about. So the key figures in that movement, just women, it's kind of heroic women like Irma O'Neill, Ruby Duncan, they were just always in our house. It was always a meeting,
Mm-hmm.
So that was just, that was just, I used to go to the school board meetings, I'd sit there with a book, strange but true football stories, it was like, that was just the atmosphere I grew up in. And it was always at the same time, this atmosphere that was like, so, there was always this massively beautiful musical soundtrack that was the backdrop against which everything happened. And my father was involved in this too, in the sense that, he was, for the time that my parents were married, it always seemed to me that he was very much in support of the work that my mom did. And very much, I think, in this way that had to do with the fact that she was doing stuff that he maybe felt like he couldn't do because he was not educated. He only went to the 9th grade, but he was supportive of the stuff that she did, and did a lot of the work. Like he was the one who got me up and dressed and ready for school and stuff like that. So it was a kind of an interesting household in that respect too. So.
When you went to college, what did you think you were going to be doing? Like what were you interested in?
And 135, 140, cadre, strong cadre of black radicals who were basically getting ready to finish it up. I did think that, but by the end of September, I knew that was wrong. So the whole time, a lot of my freshman year, first semester was just shock. My mom had been teaching and working later on in school administration, and we were part of what my old teacher at Harvard, Martin Kilson, calls the coping strata. Never very far away from just living paycheck to paycheck, but we had everything we needed to have, and also my father we were lucky. My father had his job working for Pan Am, so they were the general contractor for one of the subcontractors for the Nevada test site where he worked. So we had all these amazing trips because he would get these cheap tickets. So we went to, I think I turned 6 in Lagos, Nigeria. We went to Nigeria and Ghana and Liberia when I was a little kid, and France, and a lot of like fun trips, interesting stuff. But by the time I got to Harvard, my mom had been unemployed for a long time in Arkansas, because we moved back to Arkansas because my grandfather got sick. So we were struggling, and even in Pittsburgh we had been kind of struggling. So because she was a grad student, so basically what it meant was that I was coming from this very, very small town, poor black community in Arkansas. It was real, struggling working class situation, and that was pretty much the situation that I had been brought up in. That was certainly the situation of most of the folks in my family. So Harvard for me was a kind of a shock to the system. Mm-hmm. I had never been around that kind of highly concentrated sort of wealth before, mm-hmm. And I had never. There wasn't anything like what maybe Frazier might have called a functioning black bourgeoisie in Las Vegas. So I was introduced to that kind of social formation at Harvard too, which is probably for me even like more shocking. But and what I realized was just that kind of implicit sense of a kind of radical political commitment that I just grew up around, Other folks, the other black students certainly, for the most part, didn't have that. They had something else, but it wasn't that. It was, mm-hmm. I think we all had a certain relation to maybe the civil rights movement as a way of sort of organizing and orienting ourselves in certain ways. But that sense that what was at stake was a radical transformation of the order of things, rather than open or free access to the already existing order. There were very few of us who had the former, it seemed to me, and most of us were sort of oriented around the latter. Mm-hmm. So, and since that was so much a part of my formation and so much a part of why it was I thought I was going there, my mom would just instill in me this thing that I wasn't just going, I was being sent there. Like I wasn't just going there for myself. I was being sent there in order to be able to complete a mission. This is the way I was brought up. Mm-hmm. So like I said, realizing that everybody didn't come from that kind of thing, was something I had to get used to. And then eventually found a few other people who really did think that way. And then one of the major events, the two kind of major events intellectually, I would say my freshman year for me, were coming into contact with Martin Kilson, who I think was the first black professor at Harvard. He taught in political science. And even though I never had any interest in going into political science, he has been and continues to be this major intellectual influence for me. Mm-hmm. And then also coming into contact with a guy named Eugene Rivers, who was a kind of, I guess he was a student at Harvard at that time, who had been kind of discovered by Kilson when he was at Yale. There was a kind of interesting movie made by Warrington Hudlin, documentary film called Black at Yale, I think, about Rivers, who basically just was like this guy coming in off the streets, going into lecture halls and like shouting down the professors and correcting them. This sort of amazing autodidact, tremendously erudite in philosophy and social theory, but who was also a really committed Christian and Pentecostal, who wanted to link up these two sort of things, and who was a kind of basically major kind of what would you call it, kind of free-floating adjunct critic of black social and intellectual undergraduate life at Harvard. Mm-hmm. from a very much kind of influenced by Malcolm. And so it was this real intense kind of, he was providing the critique of what it was that I had found so alienating about sort of black undergraduate life. Mm-hmm. And I don't know anymore at this stage of the game if it was fair for him to level such a sharp, harsh critique on a bunch of 18-year-olds. But being one of those 18-year-olds, it was just right up my alley, And so very quickly, this sort of circle of a few students who kind of revolved around Rivers became my freshman year. That was my college life. Uh-huh. That and playing football, which was a whole other thing. But the football was important too, just because in both instances, those were the two places where I found some kind of comforting familiarity at a place which otherwise was totally beyond the pale for me, so to speak.
So, to jump ahead a few decades, I guess, and looking back, how do you now understand the post-civil rights? And maybe to ask a secondary question, did the election of Obama in 2008, is that an occasion to rethink that? Or are there things that we can now see about the post-civil rights era that we might not have known until that moment?
Well, as I said before, I think that there's a difference between the kind of radical commitment to a fundamental transformation of the already existing order. For me, which was something, and that commitment, which I learned after Harvard to talk about in Cedric Robinson's terms, as a black radical tradition. That strikes me as the commitment out of which the civil rights movement emerges. But one way to think about a certain kind of, let's call it, tentative preliminary result of the civil rights movement is that it makes it possible for folks to, not only possible, but in a lot of ways necessary, for people to enter into the already existing order, in order to survive better, more easily. But also, for some people, it makes possible a kind of an allegiance to that already existing social order. But for me, the black radical tradition continues, and its historical mission continues, and that's a question which is, as far as I'm concerned, sort of independent of Obama and independent of the fact of his election. Look, and I'm trying to just be kind of nice and diplomatic, in a sense, because look, I remember when I was, in my office the day after he was elected, and of course at Duke, the women who clean up the offices are black, and you get to know them and talk to them in the hallway. And they were just happy, So when she came past my door, she looked at me and just smiled, with her thumbs up, like it was a secret, but that wasn't a secret anymore, And I was totally happy that she was happy, and I understood why. I think I understood some of why she was happy. I wasn't happy, but I was happy she was happy. It was kind of like, and I don't think she had any great illusions about maybe Obama and who he was and what he was going to do. But I think she also understood in a way probably that I didn't understand as fully, that it still meant something in a certain way that this had been done. Mm-hmm. But the way that I feel, like I remember one time looking at the old McNeil-Lehrer report, and they interviewed Derek Bell, and they were talking to him about why. And it was basically this kind of great interview because you could just see that like McNeil had no clue about who this guy was or why this guy even existed. He was just a puzzle, And it was like, and you saw that he wanted to ask, and what he basically figured out a way to do by the end of the interview was ask the question that he really wanted to ask, which is like in a kind of subdued, sort of surreptitious way, which is why are why do you do this? Why are you, in other words, why is it that you maintain yourself in a relation to a justice system which you clearly don't believe in, right? And the way that Bell answered by referring to an old black woman that he knew, in the South when he was working civil rights cases, and he had asked her the same question, but in a different way. The question that Bell asked this woman had to do with her endurance, why is it that she could keep going? And the answer that she gave to Bell was, I just lives to harass white folks. And that's what Bell says to McNeil. McNeil's just, and that was it, it was like back to New York, he just, but that, look, I feel like that's what my friend was saying at Duke about Obama. It's like, if nothing else, the election has harassed white people to death. They're just fit to be tied. And so I tip my hat to it on that level. Recognizing that also constitutes this extreme danger. I mean, and just the nasty, crazy shit that they say about Obama. You end up in this horrible position of hating basically every policy that he stands for,
and defending,
and at the same time defending. I don't even feel like I'm defending him as much as I'm defending her. I'm defending the people who have an investment in him. But for me personally, I feel like over the course of time, I've just become so committed and believe so much in a certain notion or understanding of the black radical tradition. And I believe that Obama knows something about that tradition. And I'm very, very angry with him because I believe that he betrays this tradition. And I'm angrier with him than I ever could have been at George W. Bush, because the one thing I say about George W. Bush is he did not betray the black radical tradition. But I believe Obama does. So, and when I say betray, I don't mean deviate from it. Because to deviate from it would just mean, okay, you don't agree. That I can live with. But I think he was happy to mobilize it, and still constantly, in all kinds of subtle ways, performs certain moments or aspects of it in ways that I know are not real, that they are not reflected in what it is that he actually decides to do. Like him singing Al Green, that just pisses me off. I don't like it. I don't think it's cute. I'm not saying he doesn't have a right to listen to Al Green, and you could tell from the way he sings it that he has some affinity for it. But to do it in the way that he does it, in the context in which he does it, for me, it's annoying. For other people, it's a moment of being able to renew a kind of identification with him that otherwise he either could be said to deny, or maybe some people want to look at it and say he needs to deny it for some strategic reason. And so they are happy when he renews that connection, around election time. But for me, it just makes me mad.
So how do you understand? I mean, he has a pretty complex following, and a following that's been through a lot these last 3 years and has kind of redefined itself, I think, in relation to him in a certain way. How do you understand his relationship to that following this second time as we gear up for the re-election cycle, as opposed to 2008, where he was able to kind of mobilize some version of a commitment to transformation?
Well, I think I think a whole lot of, this is my opinion, my sense of his following is that there are a lot of people, not just black people, a whole lot of people in this country who at least have an instinct or an instinctual understanding or recognition of how deep and structuring the force of anti-black racism is here. Okay. And that it operates at the level of, there's these kind of great critics, scholars, thinkers working on this kind of stuff right now. University of California, Irvine, Jared Sexton, Frank Wilderson. And what Wilderson claims is that this is not a conflict, but an antagonism, right? That the antagonistic relation that black folks have to this American state and civil society. I think people understand that relationship is deep, and that structuring force is constitutive of what it is, of how it is that we live now. And my sense of it is that people, in a goodwill kind of way, know that in some fundamental sense, the gesture of voting for him is not just voting for him, but the gesture of being, which is more than just gestural, but being willing to live, let's say, under his governance, constitutes something like a refutation, or at least a gestural movement away from that structuring force of anti-black racism. And my sense of it is that that's why a lot of people voted for him. And frankly, I don't think that's a bad reason, But then but the way that like racial discourse works in the United States is like you can't just say that, So then it becomes a whole bunch of other reasons that have to do with his policies. Well, his policies are an extension of the previous administration, in so many different ways that to say that you voted for him because of his policies strikes me as not convincing. To say that you voted for him because he's smart, as opposed to the other guy being dumb, well, for me, that's not convincing, because I don't even believe in that distinction between smart and dumb in that way, especially in being black, and therefore always having to live under the shadow of necessarily being dumb. Why would I appeal to that, you see? And other people live under the shadow too. So again, I can, people who say, well, they vote because he's so smart. First of all, whatever, I mean, I think that people are going to come against. I think it's going to be the same kind of thing this year. It is first and foremost a kind of a gesture, and I don't want to discount the value of that gesture. I don't mean to denigrate it by calling it a gesture, but it is a gesture. But I believe in the value of gesture. Mm-hmm. But that's my understanding of it, primarily. And however people might be disappointed with various aspects of what he's done, in the end, that gesture outweighs pretty much any other thing that they could do within the context of American presidential politics. The one thing you could do, at least in this election, is to signal, right, that you are in some, even if it's, like I said, a gestural way, even if it's an occasional celebratory or sort of moment, you can say, I want to move against this, but to really move against it, to really dismantle this thing, it would require a whole lot more than that, But I can't point to anything that he's done as president. This is just me, that I would look back and say, well, okay, insofar as you've done this and given some indication that you might do something like this again, that's a reason to vote for you. For me, I can't see any such thing. And I just want everybody to know that I'm being polite, So.
Has there been anything in the last 3 years of his presidency that has surprised you in the opposition that he's met, or was that all completely predictable?
It seemed pretty predictable to me. It's interesting how it plays itself out. I mean, the opposition is predictable. Maybe the specific, like the birther thing to me is interesting. That I don't want to say that it's unpredictable, but I'm fascinated by it, just because it strikes me that it gives us a way to think about how it is that certain folks think about national identity, and it gives us, a relatively clear indication of just how vulgar and how backward, American political culture actually is. So, and it's always good to know, I guess what you're dealing with, and this has given us some sense of that. So that's, that's been at least noteworthy. But I mean, you had to know that certain people weren't going to be happy, and that certain people that really, for a significant chunk of the population, their world was coming down around their feet, So, people act like certain people do stuff, I mean, it'll be interesting just to see how many actual plots against his life have been foiled, with not very much time to spare over the last 4 years. Whenever that stuff comes out, it'll be, I would imagine it's been a genuinely scary experience for him doing this, Like, I remember when the healthcare thing came out. Like, it was fascinating during the election, I remember looking at, there's this great bluegrass musician named Ralph Stanley. And he did a YouTube kind of commercial for Obama. And they did Ron Howard and Andy Griffith in the roles of Opie, and Sheriff Taylor did a YouTube kind of commercial for Obama. And I thought, this is interesting. And then when the healthcare thing came out, I was like, man, if I was Obama, I'd be in Kentucky, or the Mount Western Virginia or West Virginia every weekend, just saying, I don't care if y'all like me, I don't want to, you don't have to send me your daughter, nothing. I just want y'all to be able to go to the hospital, just to mobilize, white working class folks around a kind of, around a single payer thing, which at one point at least he said he believed in, but just didn't think was politically possible. And I say, why didn't he do that? Why doesn't he attempt genuinely to mobilize folks around this idea? But then now that I think of it, I'm like, well, they couldn't have protected. I mean, that would have been logistically, he'd have had to come in there with like 2 divisions, or something. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure he's under a whole bunch of different constraints that I can't imagine and don't know about. But by the same token, for me, I won't even say it's a disappointment, because he never made it. I think he always made it clear he was going to pretty much be doing exactly what he's been doing. So I'm not disappointed in him. I mean, that speech he gave at the convention in, what was it, 2004? I was like, okay, well, this is what this is, So I'm not disappointed in him, but I don't like him. I'm not a supporter of him, And insofar as I feel sufficient, as I feel insofar as I can claim certain other activities that could be said to go against the grain of the history of anti-black racism and its structuring force, I feel like I can get a pass when it comes to voting for him. You see what I'm saying? Like, since I make other gestures, so I don't have to make that one, and I'm not gonna, I mean, I'm just staying out of that. I was always taught to stay out of stuff that's not my business. And American presidential politics is like none of my business, is the way I feel about it, So that was a bad joke, but anyway.
I've been talking to a lot of different kinds of people about this current moment in the U.S., and there's not any consensus at all on how to interpret it, but there does seem to be a pretty broad consensus that there's something extraordinary about the moment that we're living in, just in terms of the danger of the moment. And I'm wondering how you think about that. I mean, how do you understand the moment that we're in? I mean, even what does it say? What does the phrase refer to? Our current moment? What all kind of goes under that umbrella? What's important about it? How do you interpret it? What's scariest or most hopeful about it?
I don't know. when I hear people talk about, for instance, there's a Tea Party version of this discourse, as well as an Occupy Wall Street version of the discourse about the danger that has been visited upon our freedoms or our democratic way of life. That stuff rings kind of hollow for me, just because, insofar as, I said before that in a disciplinary sense, my field is performance studies. But maybe if there's some larger sense than the disciplinary of general intellectual comportment, my field is Black studies. And Black studies is the history of that precarity, and it's more than precarity. It's like, it's not that these freedoms are in a precarious situation. They're, for all intents and purposes, non-existent, or so attenuated that they might as well be. So I'm kind of like, and again, if what we're interested in is the emergence of a new kind of crisis on political economic terms, well, either on economic terms or in a purely political sense, for me, my sense of it, given the stuff that I've been working through and studying, is that the crisis is of long duration. It has been going on for a long time. That we've been living continually for centuries under a state of emergency. That doesn't mean that I'm trying to say that this isn't a dangerous situation. It's just that it's always been a dangerous situation. And at the same time, what's, I think, equally true is that we have the resources not only to survive this dangerous situation, but to begin the long process of overturning these structures that induce and impose this precarity on all of us. So in this respect, I tend towards, I hesitate to use the word because some people seem to think it's a little naive or whatever, but I'm optimistic about the situation, recognizing the dangers, recognizing the crisis, because I feel like as long as we have what it takes to do something different, and I believe that we do. We have what it takes. We have historical precedents in our back. We know something about how to fight and how to live otherwise. Matter of fact, if people weren't already living otherwise in a whole bunch of different ways, they'd be dead anyway. Okay, so we have the wherewithal to do something different on a small scale and on a large scale. And I'm optimistic about that. And I'm optimistic about it also because I think people generally recognize the need to live otherwise. So, and to the extent that an increasing number of people seem to recognize that they too are living in a crisis and in a state of emergency, then that would probably tend to make me a little more optimistic rather than to feel more worried. Mm-hmm. In other words, if more and more people are recognizing that this is that the life we lead is deadly, then that strikes me as a good thing, and hopefully people will, continue to be able to try to figure out ways to work for that, So, so anyway, I guess it's a slightly different.
Well, yeah, no, it's interesting though. So aside from the widespread signals of discontent, I mean, what would be concrete signs to you that would kind of nourish your optimism? Like, what would be the things that you would look for as positive signs of I guess a kind of meaningful engagement with the crisis?
Well, I mean, all over the world, people are engaged in a bunch of different kinds of activities that are all geared towards, directed towards a kind of radical transformation. And, not just the Arab Spring or not just what's been happening in Greece for the last 4 years, and obviously greater intensity the last 4 days, but workers' movements in Argentina, people taking over factories, the emergence of new social centers in Italy, in Durham, North Carolina. There's signs of life everywhere. I think you have to close your eyes not to see the signs of life, and really it becomes about what it is that you see. And again, I'm not advocating some kind of denial or refusal to look squarely, or whatever you want to say, in a clear-eyed way or in an unflinching way at how difficult and bad and horrific and terrible and impossible the situation is. But there's other things going on too, and there have always been these other things going on. It's not, maybe for me, I don't think of this as sort of a phantasmatic exercise. I think of it as a necessary historical exercise. You learn about the levelers and the diggers and the antinomian. There's a history there's an ongoing history of revolt, that we are a part of, that we live within. And I do believe that history of revolt has had effects, the greatest effect is that it allows us to survive and to persist, which for me is no mean feat. I subscribe to Audre Lorde when it comes to that. That what's alive in us and most essential to what it means to be a living human being on Earth, for the people who run things in the world, that element of what it is that we are was not meant to survive. So the fact that it persists and the fact that it survives is like cause, so that the first thing you should do when you wake up in the morning is to celebrate. And then the next thing you should do is try to figure out how to kill some shit, basically. So
yeah. Well, this has been fabulous. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you feel that we should have?
Well, the one thing I was going to say, just in terms of my own intellectual formation, is when my mom went back to graduate school. It doesn't matter. But there were just some people I felt like I wanted to mention, just to say their names out loud. These fellow students of my mom's in grad school who are all young and who all also just totally kind of took me under their wing and dragged me around, and who I learned a lot from, Stephanie Brown and Greg Robinson and Leonard Bodrick, all these young guys. First time I remember Leonard Bodrick went to Orangeburg State, and that was the first time I ever heard about the students being killed at Orangeburg. I'd always heard about Kent State, and I remember Greg Robinson, who's this guy from Langston, Oklahoma, who had the entire first side of Lou Rawls Live memorized, including every grunt, every pause, And I just remember being so impressed by that level of listening, stuff like that. So those guys were really big, influences on me. So it was just a big thing to be part of, this kind of a life that eventually you learn enough to recognize it as a really pretty intense kind of intellectual life, and social life. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. On your good days, do you feel that you're able to kind of pay that to the people coming up behind you?
I hope so. I mean, I try hard with my students. You know, I hope so. It certainly is for me like the most important thing. And it's funny because the writing, I realized over the course, I mean, teaching is really important, and just being available and hanging out with students. And like, it's not, I don't think it's as important for them as it is for me, but like, I love office hours, you know. I'm sitting there all the time with my door open, hoping to lure somebody in so we can talk about something. But I feel like that kind of, you know, that kind of engagement with students and friends and, you know, colleagues and stuff is the most important thing. And the writing I do is kind of like to prepare myself for the conversations, which is probably why some people say it seems so like maybe obscure. But it's really because it's part of, you know, professional and you have to write. But it's really like, I feel like it's just notes. Like I'm writing this stuff to myself, trying to get it down on paper. And then once I get it down on paper, I actually have a better grasp of what I'm trying to get at, so I can talk about it with my students, and it ends up sounding much, you know, it ends up sounding different. But yeah, I mean, again, my mom was a teacher, you know, and her students were like a big part of her life, became part of our family. Mm-hmm. So I always wanted to do that same thing. I mean, I feel basically so lucky about the way I grew up that for me it's like this total model, you know, for what I would like to have for my kids. So it's partly just because that's the kind of house I want to live in, you know, and I think, you know, Laura is the same way. And at the same time, it's just part of what it means to be in this kind of, I mean, I started thinking about like Minton's Playhouse as like a monastery, you know, like a kind of secular monastery, you know, in which people were committed and devoted in this intense, sacred kind of a way to a certain kind of intellectual and spiritual life. And I feel like there's these little zones and pockets of black social life that work that way. Uh-huh. And what they are zones of study, you know. And the fact that this kind of study and this kind of really celebratory relation to the very thing that allows us to be together in the first place, this is, you know, it's just about trying to keep that going, you know, because it's not like you keep that going in order to try to get something better. You keep that going because what you want it to be is like that all the time. You know, I mean, I started thinking about the civil rights movement. I was like, well, the thing about the civil rights movement was, it was like, because you see those meetings that they would have, and so like, I think they just wanted to be able to do that all the time. That's what it was about. It wasn't so we could like drink at this water fountain or go to that, ride on that bus. It was so that we could get together and decide what we wanted to do about our social lives all the time. Mm-hmm. You know, it was so it could be like this every night. You know, I mean, I really think that that there was that gathering, that intensity of social life that was actually turned out to be what it was that people were fighting for. Mm-hmm. Was to be, you know, and it was what life in those conditions was a level of duress that made it almost impossible to do that, you know. Mm-hmm. And then anyway, blah blah blah. But so yeah, that's what I'm trying to. That's what I would love to be able to. That's what I'm trying to figure out some kind of way to contribute something to. So.
I like that formulation of celebrating and killing shit. It's
well. Look, man, I mean, there's so much, you know, Laura, my wife, we're trying to figure out where we're going to send our oldest son to school, you know, next year. And what we're coming to grips with is that, at least in Durham, there's this really insidious use of the charter school thing to basically, it's being used to sort of, as a friend of mine in Chapel Hill, he emailed me this morning. I wish I brought my computer. I could have just read his analysis of it because it was totally spot on. This guy named Alvaro Reyes, who teaches in the geography department at UNC, saying it's like the imposition of a new, what do you call it, post-Keynesian neoliberal geography. And what you've got in the urban spaces is like the parks and the public schools are barriers, literally are like these little, like they're almost like outposts or forts that make it impossible. They're like these strategic facts on the ground that constitute a form of resistance to this new geography. And so the charter school movements become a real interesting way to kind of use those spaces and to literally overtake those spaces. And that's what's happening in Durham right now, I think, around this place called Central Park School, which has just become an unwelcoming place for Black and Latino students after initially starting out to be a place that was supposed to extend to those students some of the benefits and some of the resources that had traditionally been accruing to, affluent white students, in the area. And it's just brutal, So basically, what I mean when I say kill shit is for me, not killing anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say that on the one hand, it's funny, I've been thinking a lot about this question of violence, just reading Fanon and stuff like that and trying to come up with a way of understanding what I take to be, as he would say, the necessary, unavoidable violence of any kind of anti-colonial struggle, any kind of struggle against the settler. It's violent because it's got to be a violent overturning of the very order which constitutes that settler's subjectivity. So to say that it's not violent, or to imagine that it would not be violent, is an imprecision, And I think that the militant, it's something like a distinction that King would make, and I think Gandhi too, between violence and militancy, right? But that's the shit I'm talking about killing. Is this whole, the things that produce not so much persons, but the things that produce persons in this way. Okay, and the school is like a perfect example because that's what they're producing. In addition to, again, being devoted or sort of submitted or instrumentalized in this way that's gonna basically make some people some money. Former Duke basketball players, a whole bunch of money because they own most of downtown. In addition to that, it's also producing some little subjects who, the stories that I could tell are just literally, the kids themselves are literally sanctioned and protected insofar as they visit a certain kind of brutality on other students. And there's no way to limit that just to students of color, okay? Right? So that's what's got to be stopped. That school, insofar as it's producing subjects like that, has to be killed. And this is something that I think, will be something to work on and work around, in Durham over the next few years. So, and that's not the only thing, obviously,
right.
But I think it's a particularly insidious kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I think that's actually a great note to end on because it's committed. So,
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.